I feel like this video needs to start out with a little bit of an explanation. Last year, Linda Tillman, who is the president of the Georgia Beekeepers Association, called me up and asked me if I would be the keynote speaker at a banquet dinner celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the Georgia Beekeepers Association. To be real honest, I was a little bit surprised and, of course, felt a little bit honored to be asked to do this, and I agreed. It went well that night. The talk was good. I think the people there enjoyed it a lot, and I certainly had a lot of fun doing it. But only one thing went wrong, and that is that this camera, which I've taken all my YouTube videos with, really struggled to stay in focus that night with the low light conditions. The lights had been turned down in anticipation of the slides that I was going to show. I didn't realize it until 3 days later when I had a chance to look at it, and I was very disappointed and decided I would not use it for anything and put it aside and forgot about it. Well, since that time, I've been prompted a lot and had a lot of comments. What are we going to do with this? When are we going to see it? And so I've decided to work with it, and I've edited in still shots wherever the camera was doing very poorly. And after looking at it, I don't think it's so bad after all. So for better or for worse, here it is.
And I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce Bob Binnie. We were trying to figure out who would be the absolutely perfect person to talk to us at our 100th year. And we wanted someone who had been important in the beekeeping world in Georgia and had been a solid person for GBA. And Bob Binnie certainly meets both of those categories. He's a past president of the Georgia Beekeeping Association, and I remember going to the meeting that he ran in Raven County, and I was absolutely in awe of Bob. I was in awe of how he ran the meeting. I was in awe of how he set the meeting up. And now that I've been the president of GBA for the last 4 years, he's my role model for how to do it well. So I hope I've lived up to what he set as a good model back then. And Bob has been generous and open to so many of us as beekeepers. He makes his company, Blue Ridge Honey, available for tour, and I think many of you have probably been to his facility to see the beautiful place he has in Lake Mount, Georgia, where he sells bee equipment and has established himself very well in his business. And he's going to talk to us tonight about his own history as we tell stories about our beekeeping for the last, over the 100 years of, he hadn't been doing it for 100 years. We've been around for 100 years, and he has lots of stories to tell about his own experience in the beekeeping world. So everybody join me in welcoming Bob Binnie.
When Linda called and asked me to speak, I was just a little bit taken aback, to be real honest. And I didn't let on what I was thinking, Linda, but I thought, these banquets are for famous people, you know, people that are well known. And after I got off the phone with her, and I said to myself, why not? I mean, I've been coming to these meetings for 26 years. I have kind of an anniversary tonight myself. Yeah. And 26 years, and I've only missed 2 meetings. That I'm not sure that anybody else can say that. And there's just a few faces in the crowd that I remember from those days. PN, where's PN and Evelyn? Yeah, a lot of you newer beekeepers do not know who PN and Evelyn are. PN was president of this club multiple times. He did his tour 2 years and then skipped a year, and nobody would step up and do it again. So, and he did it again. And
glutton for punishment.
Glutton for punishment, yeah. Well, I'm just going to embarrass you here for a minute because I haven't been here for the whole 100 years, obviously, but in the time I've been here, PN and Evelyn have done more for this club than anybody I know, and I really would like you all to give them a round of applause. Yeah, stand up and take a bow. There you go.
Thank you, Bob.
You're very welcome. When I was president, I did one of those presidential, what do they call it, a decree or something. I awarded these guys a lifetime membership to this club, and it was well deserved, yeah. Anyway, the only other face I see here tonight that I remember from the distant past is, I'm going to embarrass you, Barry Hart right there at that table. He's from the distant past too. He's a commercial beekeeper from Fargo, Georgia. My introduction to Barry was watching him speak in a very small room in Richmond Hill. Do you remember you doing that, Barry? Linda, there's a guy you might want to talk to a little later. He knows what he's talking about, large commercial beekeeper in Fargo. He'd make a great speaker. I listened to him talk about producing comb honey. That could be a good topic. Now, he's probably cussing at me under his breath right now. And the other thing that I really want to recognize here is that in this 26 years, I've seen a lot of stuff. I've seen some meetings that I really didn't, it felt like a waste of time to be there, and I've seen some meetings that were outstanding. And in all of these 26 years, I've never seen this club be more vibrant than it is right now. And I have to believe that that's because of the people that are in charge. A couple of them, 3 of them are right here. Gina and Linda and what's her name? I'm sorry, I had a senior moment there. Julia? Yeah, I apologize, but that's all good. No, I mean it. Yeah, you guys have done a great job, and I'm going to do something that's going to sound really weird, but I want to toast the Georgia Beekeepers Association. I want to toast the last 100 years. I want to toast what's going on right now, and I want to toast those that are going to lead it into the future. Yeah, nothing but good ahead. Okay, where did I stick my pointer? Right here. I've been at this a long time. A long time. I asked Linda, what do you want me to talk about? She said, well, tell us why you got interested in bees and what it's been like along the way. And for me, it's been very unique. My story is much different than anybody else. I actually became interested in bees in Alaska, of all places, in 1976. Now, what is that, 44 years ago? I read a book called How to Keep Bees and Sell Honey by Walter T. Kelly. It was published in 1955. Some of the older beekeepers would remember that book. And I was living in the bush in Alaska, and at nights we had nothing to do but read. That was all we could do. And got my hands on a copy of that book, and I must have read it 10 times from cover to cover, and I said, this is what I want to do. Right then and there, I knew I wanted to be a commercial beekeeper. And I sent off, I mail ordered a bunch of books. I got ABCs, XYZs, and Hive and the Honeybee, and read them from cover to cover, believe that or not. That's hard to believe. Not many people have read that book from cover to cover. And
Long Nights in Alaska.
Long Nights in Alaska, yeah. So after a few years later, my wife Suzette and I left Alaska. We'd been there for 6 years, and with the sole intent of finding an opportunity to get involved in commercial beekeeping. I really wanted to do it, and we call it drive out. We drove out of Alaska in January of 1981. It was extremely cold. We left in a Volkswagen van with a newborn baby, and we toured a good deal of the country in that Volkswagen van in that late winter. And I talked to extension agents and beekeepers, and just was watching for an opportunity and never found it. And I had some relatives in Southern Oregon, and so I think we left from Missouri or somewhere like that and headed back to Oregon because we were running out of money and we just needed a place to land. And it's funny how life does things for you. You know, sometimes it seems like the script's already written. Have you ever felt that way? Well, it was for me. We landed in Southern Oregon, and I literally spent our last $400. God bless Suzette, she didn't say a word. Spent our last $400 on 8 colonies, 8 triple deep colonies. Yeah, and that was my getting established in the bee business. And the man that I bought them from told me about an old fellow that lived in Central Point, Oregon. And he said, this is where you can buy smokers and veils and things like that. And that he's the man. He was my pot of gold. I picked up those 8 colonies. My dad helped me move them. I didn't have a smoker. We didn't have bales, and they were loaded with bees. And we backed the truck up, and they were just bearded, you know, from top to bottom. It was a warm, late April night. And he said, how do we do this? And I said, well, I know that if you smoke them, they'll go in. And we didn't have a smoker, but my dad was a cigarette smoker. He smoked Camel cigarettes. And he got them in, but he was green in the face by the time. Yeah, he got them in, and we loaded them up with minimal stings and got them home. And the man I bought them from said, oh, they're perfect. He knew of my aspirations. I said, I want to make lots of bees. He said, these are perfect. And he was right, but not in the way that I intended. When I split them open, they were full of cells. Every single one of them had either swarmed or was getting ready to. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? And I'd read a book, you know, you can split with queen cells. I knew that, and I thought, I need more equipment. And the man had told me about this fella in Central Point, so I went to see him. And he was a retired commercial beekeeper. His name was Delmer Smith. Isn't that an old-fashioned name, Delmer? And I told him about, you know, what I was in the middle of, and he says, I know just what you need. And it was so funny. I gave him a list of stuff that I thought I needed, and he said, give me a minute, and he started gathering up a lot of stuff, and he was piling stuff up in the middle of the floor, and I thought to myself, this isn't what I was asking for. And when it was all over, he says, this is what you need. I mean, it was a pile of stuff, and I had almost no money. And I said, I can't afford this. And he said, don't worry about it. First time I ever met him. He says, don't worry about it. He said, you can pay me in wax and honey later. And it really gave me pause. I said, this is a stranger. This is kind of weird. But I took him up on it. And I split those colonies into about 35 colonies. And that was my introduction into splitting. Been splitting ever since. So I got to know him really good that summer. He was a wonderful person. He had run 2,000 colonies with just one helper in the Rogue Valley in southern Oregon in his heyday. His introduction into beekeeping was 1918 when he started running the bees on the family farm. Of course, he's long past now, but in those days he was just a good old guy. And all summer long, you know, we'd talk, and he knew what I needed even before I did, and he'd give it to me and say, don't worry about it, you can catch up later. And then that fall, I guess it was September actually, he says, I can tell that you're very serious about this. You really do want to be a commercial beekeeper. And I said, yes, sir. And he gave me the best advice I've ever had in my life. And he said, if you want to be a commercial beekeeper, you need to work for a commercial beekeeper for a while. He says, that way you'll escape a lot of the pitfalls that might befall you. And he was right. I mean, he was dead right. And he called a friend of his. I was there to listen to his end of the conversation. Delmer was a very simple person, very few words, just it was right down to business, and the conversation kind of went like this. Glenn, you need help still? I got somebody. I'm sending him over. It was just that simple. So I got over there, and Glenn had no idea that I was interested in beekeeping. He needed somebody in his wood shop. He had a big wood shop doing custom beekeeping equipment, and supplied a lot of people, anything he wanted. You wanted custom pallets, custom boxes, custom lids, he'd do it. And I worked in that shop all winter long, and it was a tremendous experience. You know, I learned how to make good beekeeping equipment and learned how to do it right, and that was very important for my future. Because if you're poor and you don't have what you need a table saw, and you need to know how to use it. Anyway, Glenn had 2,200 colonies, and this was in the Rogue Valley in southern Oregon, and he just had 1 or 2 helpers, and we became friends. He was a good guy, so it didn't take but a month or 2 that we were good friends, and he knew I had a lot of truck driving experience, and I guess it was early February. He needed to move his bees down to San Joaquin Valley, and asked me if I'd drive one of the trucks, and I said, you bet. You know, I was game. This was just what I was looking for. And we moved 2 truckloads down into Madera, California. Barry, if you know where Madera is. And it was a bad night. I mean, we were stuck in the mud. It was just the stuff you read about. We didn't get done unloading till 10:30 the next morning. We were absolutely stung from head to toe. And the head beekeeper that was working for him, his name was Dave, and I'll never forget Dave. We were exhausted. You know, that just leaning against the truck, that deer in the headlight kind of stare, just totally exhausted, not even speaking. And Dave said something pretty weird. He said, if God wanted man to work at night, he would have made it so he could see in the dark. And Glenn and I looked at each other. It was the way he said it. There was something wrong, very wrong there. And about 10 seconds later, he put out a few colorful 4-letter words and said, I quit, I ain't doing this no more. So it was a kind of a cool drive home back to Oregon. Now keep in mind, we'd been up all day, all night, now the next day. And when we got back that evening back into southern Oregon and Dave took off, and Glenn turned to me and he said, you're really serious about this, aren't you? And I said, yes, sir, I am. He said, this is what I'll do. He says, I'll pay you $80 a day and you have to do whatever I say. Now in 1981, $80 a day wasn't bad wages, but considering what I was about to have to do, I'm not so sure. I was very young then. I was in my mid-20s, and I was very capable, very strong. I was tough when I was young. Not so much anymore, but back then I could really take it, and Glenn made very good use of that. And we finished moving his 2,200 colonies into California, and we spent a month down there with the bees. We camped out in a abandoned barn, and that was kind of the precursor to much of that type of stuff for the next several years. There was a barn owl that hung out in there with us. I loved it. I mean, we spread out the sleeping bags and we hooked up a hose to some water in the distance, and we were good there. Spent a month in the almonds, and there's not too many people in this room that can relate with this, but Barry, am I wrong? The almonds, when the weather's right and they're in full bloom, it's heaven on earth. I tell you, you can smell a orchard from a quarter mile away. I mean, it's intense. I was on a 3,000-acre almond ranch, and I'll tell you a little joke out there. You know, we call them almonds, but in California they call them almonds. And do you know the answer to why they do that? It's because they shake the L out of them. That's how they get the that's how they get the nuts off the trees. Just like pecans, they shake them to death. Anyway, so after that month, we picked them up and we went to southern Oregon and pollinated pears. That was home, close to home, 45 minutes from home. Pollinated for, is it Henry and David? Am I saying that right? Harry and David, that's right. You're familiar with them. Pollinated for them and some other big orchards there in southern Oregon. Then we picked them up and moved them to Washington State and pollinated apples on the eastern side of the Cascades near Wenatchee, if anybody here knows that area. And this whole time it's just camping out. We stayed in apple packing houses and abandoned mobile homes. It was just crazy, but I loved it. It was just like gypsy with the bees. And then on to North Dakota for honey production, and I stayed with him for 3 years and did this routine, while at the same time I was building up my own outfit. And after 3 years I had 300 colonies of my own, and then the year I quit him I grew to 500 suddenly just in that year, and I was on my way. And what you're going to see here tonight is a little bit like home movies. Some of these pictures are extremely old, 3 or 4 decades old. They were taken with a Kodak Instamatic camera. Some of you might remember that. Yeah. Yeah. Do you still have one of those? Well, you need to put it on a shelf and enshrine it or something. But yeah, we used the heck out of that back in the 80s.
Biggs Junction.
Say that again?
Biggs Junction. It's Junction.
It's a fun story. Okay, Biggs broke down in Biggs Junction. That's going to be the name of the article when I write it. I freelanced one season as a truck driver. I drove for about anybody that would pay me. And I picked up a load of bees in Troutsdale, Oregon. That's in the Willamette Valley. For those that aren't familiar with Oregon, that's where the Oregon Trail, that's where all of those people were going, was the Willamette Valley, very fertile valley. And when you leave Portland, I think it's I-80 that leaves Oregon. It's a beautiful drive. You follow the Columbia River, which it might be the second biggest river in the country. I know the Mississippi's bigger, but I don't think anything else is. It's a huge river up there, and you get in this narrow gorge. Beautiful drive, and I left at sun up, or just barely could see the sunrise when I left, and got fuel and had intended to stay on the road all the way to northern Idaho, you know, run all day long. That's the way we did it with the bees. You have to during certain weather. And Oregon is unusual. Most people don't realize this. You do. but eastern part of Oregon is actually high desert and can get quite warm in the summer. And I was just climbing kind of over that, I guess you'd call it a pass, where it goes from almost like rainforest into the high desert. And the truck, I heard a loud ping, you know, and I thought, oh my gosh, it started running on 6 cylinders. And I could see that the oil pressure was still good and the water temperature was still good, so I kept on limping down the interstate. And I knew that Biggs Junction was ahead, and I knew there was a truck stop there. And I pulled into that truck stop and said, are there any diesel mechanics here? And they said, no, there isn't. And I said, well, is there anybody that has an off-road forklift so I can get this truck unloaded? It was supposed to be unseasonably hot in late May. It was going to be near record temperatures, and I was looking at a meltdown on that truck. You have to keep moving during hot temperatures or the bees will melt down. In the old days, when we used to use wax foundation rather than the plastic that we do now, it wasn't that the colonies actually melted. The combs would get extremely soft and they would sag, and then the honey would start to break loose and ooze. And I'd seen it happen once where it was just honey running off the truck. And, as you might imagine, it just ruins a load of bees. And that's what I was looking at. I was desperate to get that truck unloaded. And they said, well, there's a tractor repair guy about 6 miles down this side road. I think he's got an off-road tractor forklift. So I limped on down to his place, and I pulled into the parking lot. And I could see him and his helper looking out the plate glass window in the office. They were just staring out the window like that. And so I walked up towards the office there, and he came outside, and I said, I've got a problem. He didn't say a word. They just were staring at the truck. And I said, I've got a problem. And I went on about I had to get these bees off, and it was open desert. I mean, I could have just drove across the street and unloaded the truck. Asked him about a forklift, never said a word, not a peep. I thought, oh God, this is a waste of time. Their jaws were dropped open, and I was literally starting to look out across the desert just to see where I could go park the truck and just let it melt down. And he really slowly started to say, you know, you've got a problem. But here's what's so fun about it. And he said, you know, I used to work for a beekeeper, and I drove a truck a lot like that one right there. He was going real slow. And now he had my attention. Now I was looking back at him, you know. And he said, why don't you just pull that truck along the north side of the building here? And he motioned to his helper, and he said, go over to the next door neighbor, see how many sprinklers and hoses you can get. And in 10 minutes flat, we had that truck covered up in sprinklers and hoses, and I was just in awe thinking, who's really in charge here anyway? It ain't me, that's for sure. Anyway, he saved that load of bees, and we'd broken an exhaust valve. That's what the noise had been. And in about 45 minutes, he had figured out which head it was and had that head off. And he lent me his pickup and sent me on a trip to Portland. He knew a machine shop that would work all night, and I guess I got there, I don't know, 11 or 12 at night, and the guy worked on the head the rest of the night, and I took it back, and at 10 o'clock in the morning the next day I was back on the road. And that's the story broke down in Biggs Junction. I'm going to try to write it. There's a little more to it. It's more colorful, but I don't have that kind of time here. I've got a broke down in Missoula, Montana. I've got a broke down in Turlock, California. I got lots of them. The guy I was working for was running on a shoestring. You know, God bless him. He was doing the best he could. And the trucks were old, and there was lots of baling wire involved and things like that. Anyway, back to our home movies here. See if this thing will work for me. That's actually the beginning. And it has been an adventure. It really has. Reeder, North Dakota, 1983. For old truck buffs, that's a 1958 Peterbilt. It had a 220 Cummins. That's a small motor, by the way, for a semi-truck. And it had 2 transmissions. It was a 4x4. That's the way trucks were back in the 50s and the 40s. You had a main box with an auxiliary box that split all the gears. And it really took a real truck driver to drive. No power steering, no power anything. That's why the wheels were as big as a tire. And there was a reason that truck drivers had big arms back then. Those were real trucks. Anyway, I broke down in that truck too, so. That's me in the front there doing the nets there, and that's Glenn back there on the forklift. That's back, Barry, you remember the Bobcats that actually came from the factory with the mast? That's one of them right there. There wasn't many of them, but back in the late 70s and early 80s, that's what most of the beekeepers were trying to get their hands on. This is me in Montana. Like I said, home movies, right? And what's unique about this picture is that's my dad in the picture. He wasn't part of the beekeeping scene, but Glenn needed somebody to help drive trucks for about 3 weeks when we were moving out of the apples, and my dad was out of work for temporarily, and he was a very experienced truck driver, so he helped me make these trips out of Washington State to North Dakota. And what was so unique about this episode in my life is that I was in charge. And my dad did a really good job. That's 2 trucks there. That one he's standing behind is a truckload of bees also. This is my days in Oregon after I'd left Glenn. This was my first real bee truck. It was a 1965 Ford F650, and it had a lot of miles on it, but I spent the money and took the time and rebuilt the engine and transmission and brakes and all that stuff, and I put a lot of miles on it, had a lot of tanks on it. I could drive 1,100 miles without stopping. And you can see, Barry, I used 6-ways back then. I don't do that anymore. Yeah, well, when you're pollinating, it is, because when you move bees into this 3,000-acre ranch I was on, I swear some of them aisles were a 1/4 mile long, and any time you can pick up 2 pallets and have the equivalent of another pallet on your forklift, it was worth it. Ran 10 frame 6-way pallets back then. Now I threw this picture in here not because it's special, but it reminds me to tell a story of this trip. This truck, I was going through Stockton, California, loaded. And the only thing on that truck that I hadn't replaced at that time, I'd rewired it, I mean, I'd done a lot, but I hadn't got to the master brake cylinder yet. And I had to get fuel in Stockton, and I got off at a major 4-lane boulevard there at Stockton. It was one of those long 2-lane off-ramps going down, and heavy load, as you could see, and forklift and all. And I got halfway down that off-ramp, and the brake pedal just suddenly went to the floor. Now, what I was looking at ahead of me was full array of cars going both ways on this boulevard. And there was 2 lanes on the off-ramp, and the right side was full, but the left side wasn't. And it was the scariest time in my entire life. When I hit the bottom of that off-ramp at about 40 miles an hour, it was one of those big gutter dips at the bottom, and I just slammed down into that gutter, and then I slammed up over the crown in the boulevard. Hurt my neck on bashing my head up against the top of the cab. And PN, you're old enough, you remember the Keystone Cops? Oh, yeah. That's exactly what it looked like. There was cars screeching and horns honking and cars going sideways, and I just went right through it all and up the off-ramp, on-ramp on the other side. Yeah, crazy moment. And finally got the truck stop on the other side, and I swear it took me a minute to decide whether I needed to change my underwear or not. Had to think about that a minute. Anyway, one of the scariest episodes I'd ever had driving a truck. Anyway, this is Madera, California. This is an interesting story for me too. This was a Japanese grower that had this orchard here. He had 670 acres. Before World War II, he'd had almost 1,200, and he had to go into one of those concentration camps they had in California. Actually, I think he went to Utah, he told me. When he came back, he could only get 670 acres of his property back. But when I met him, he didn't seem bitter. He was a nice old guy. He was in his mid-80s, and he was from Japan. I mean, he was the real deal. And his wife was the old-fashioned Japanese woman that would walk 10 steps behind. She was the real deal too, and she was probably the sweetest person I've ever met in my life. And she couldn't speak any English. And I knew that if I went to the front door, I had to be prepared to have tea and cookies, because maybe she understood when I said no, I don't know, but she wouldn't take it. She would drag me in the house. And I had to have tea and cookies, so I stayed away from the front door unless I had some time on my hands. But he was an organic grower. Way back there in 1985, he was completely organic. He was way ahead of his time. And the man that had got me this contract was a friend of mine that lived in Coos Bay, Oregon, and he connected me with this man. This is a funny, not a beekeeping story, but it's still so interesting. This man had been through several campaigns in the South Pacific during World War II, major islands. He'd been to 3 of them. I don't remember the one. There was about 4 or 5 of them that were just bloodbaths, and he'd been to 3 of them. And when he came back from the war, he spent a lot of time in jail because he could not see a Japanese man without starting a fight. He couldn't do it. He said he couldn't help himself. He said eventually he got over it, and he connected. He was a broker for almonds. He was an almond broker, and he met this old Japanese man, and somehow they became the very best of friends. And somehow they both got over it or whatever. And when he had me pick up this contract, he says, I want to tell you the reason I'm having you do this is because I want you to take care of this man, and I know you will. So somehow he'd gotten over all of that. It was pretty interesting situation. What you'll notice here, there's a lot of early pictures and then later pictures. In the middle, I just didn't have a camera and didn't bother. So you're missing the middle years here. This is Untitled, Georgia. It's just a picture of a holding yard getting ready to load. Smoking the bees, getting ready to load them up. Picture of me loading. It's actually, I was loading, that load was going to Wisconsin. That year we sent bees to Wisconsin. I've had bees in California, Oregon, Washington, Wisconsin, South Dakota, North Carolina, Florida, and of course Georgia. That's Florida. Barry, you know where that picture is at, right? We were in that same orchard in the same year. That's a huge orchard. It's 42 square miles of orange orchard. Yeah. That's on the big ditch that goes through the middle, if you remember that. I threw this in because I didn't know this. I lived in California. I was born in California, but did not know this. Oranges actually bloom before the last year's fruit is off. Did you all know that? It's very interesting. This is the same place. You remember, Barry? They gave us 2 days notice to get out because they were going to spray. Yeah, that's why I don't go to the oranges anymore. Anyway, this is just getting ready to leave. Me and Alberto loading the truck. We loaded this truck. Let me back up. We loaded that truck, got it all tied down, and it got dark. It was about 11 o'clock. We were going to Jasper, only about 3 hours, or what, 3 or 4 hours, I don't know, maybe 5. And the truck driver came over to me and said, "My truck won't start." What? He said, "The alternator's out. The battery's dead. I can't do nothing." I said, "Oh my God, I can't unload all these bees right now." So we got one of my trucks and we put some air in his tank so the brakes would let loose, and we pulled him out from underneath the trailer and left the trailer sitting there the next day. And then the next night they pulled in another truck and tied up and left. Let me back. There's another story here. Barry will appreciate this story. That same truck, that same load, we got him out the next night, and he was headed for Jasper, Florida, and I left in my truck and forklift, not far behind him, maybe half hour, 20 minutes. And when I got to the Wildwood scales, I can remember saying, I think it was Sam that was with me, Tommy. I said, "Sam," I said, "that looks like a bee truck stuck on the scales there." And I got closer and I said, "Oh crap, that's my bee truck stopped on the scale." And the scale master was outside talking to the driver. Now you know that's serious when they do that. Pointing at the driver like this. I said, "Oh my God." Anyway, I went around, I got the green light, went all the way around and came back the other side. And by that time the truck was parked. And there was 2 drivers in the truck, and one was walking back towards the shack there, and I said to the other one, I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "The scale master tells us this truck is seriously overweight, and it's not going anywhere until you get some of this weight off of here."
I've unloaded them there before.
Have you? Well, here's what happened. I got stuck in that holding yard for 2 days in a full-blown flow, I don't know how much weight they put on, but apparently it was a serious amount. And in that holding yard right there. And so I just knew better. I said, well, let's just see what the scale master and this guy says. We waited about 10 minutes. So here comes the driver and the scale master, and the scale master comes over to my door and knocks on the window, and I rolled it down. He says, you own this load of bees? I said, yes, sir. I said, well, I played the cowering dog. Yes, sir. Anything you want, sir. You know, it's the only thing you can do. He said, I have considered the ramifications of leaving this truck here till the sun. It didn't have any nets on it because it was only a few hours down the road, so we didn't net it. You know, why would we net it? And he says, you're going to Jasper, which wasn't far. I mean, we weren't far from Jasper. I said, yes, sir. He says, well, if you promise never to do this again. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Said, okay, hit the road. I don't want to see you back here again like this. What's that?
Your scale guy was nicer than I was.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'll never forget. And that's exactly what he said. I've considered the ramifications of That's in Jasper. Those are Robert's yards. Remember, I used his yards for a couple years. That's just a load that came back from California. Loading for South Dakota. This was just last spring, 2019. For those of you that don't know, we have red lights on our forklifts because bees don't see red. And when you're loading with white lights, you just get absolutely hammered with bees if it's a hot night. This was early June and it was hot, and without red lights, it's a sting fest basically. So, because you're hot, the bees are hot, you're sweating, you're wet. We always leave a gap down the middle of the load. It's very important that these trucks keep moving, and we separate the two rows of pallets so the air runs down the middle, and the driver has instructions to not stop for anything during daylight hours except for maybe to go pee or whatever. And this is just the same stuff. That's the load when it was finished, ready to go. He parked there for the night and left out at 8 o'clock in the morning with real strict instructions, and that's where he arrived 2 days later. That's Roberts. That's up at Roberts. Now the next pictures are really interesting. Yeah, that's what happened in South Dakota this last summer. That's Carol. You know Carol, yeah. I'd seen that happen in North Dakota once. The Glenn who I worked for, he had a 350-pound average one year, and the only reason it wasn't better is he couldn't keep up. He couldn't keep the supers. They just plugged out. In fact, he got sued that year. He had leased some bees from Seattle, and the Washington beekeeper sued him and said, you ruined my bees because you let them plug out so badly that they had no broodum, and now I have no bees. It killed the bees. They were building comb under the pallets because they had no place else to do it. That's just one of our typical bee yards in northeast Georgia. We like to run double deeps. This picture just happens to be singles. I thought I'd throw it in because there's some information there. We have to have bare fences. We have to. No bare fences, no bees. It's as simple as that. And you can see how we feed with buckets and jars and whatnot. That picture was just taken today. I took it this morning so y'all could see our facilities there. On 441 in northeast Georgia, in Rabun County, the most northeasterly county in Georgia. The building on the right is big. It's bigger than the picture looks. It's a 182 by 82, and then half of it is 2-story. So there's about 20,000 square feet in that. And then the smaller building on the left is a 40 by 90. That's our wood shop, repair shop, where we work on equipment and things like that. And that was last summer's crew. You can see Suzette and I. Now this is a picture that commercial beekeepers see a lot. This is the sun coming up the next morning. I can't impress upon you how many hours it's involved in being a commercial migratory beekeeper. In the days when I was trucking back and forth to North Dakota, It was very typical to work all day, load the bees on the truck at night, get out in the extremely early morning. It was a 32-hour nonstop drive to North Dakota, and I do all of that with 2 hours sleep. And I saw scenes like that a lot. It's just the way it is. I mean, you know, moving them at night. And that's the end. Visit us on Facebook. We got a YouTube channel. I'm not a commercial YouTube video maker, trust me, but there's a couple on there that are interesting. And that's it. Does anybody have any questions before you? And yes, ma'am.
What brought you from Arkansas to Georgia?
What brought me to Georgia? Well, that's another story. You sure you want another story? Okay. Well, in the late 80s, my dad wanted to buy a little store, gas station, garage, laundromat thing near the coast of Oregon, and he couldn't do it alone, so he asked me if I would do it with him. So I sold most of my bees. I kept some, and I went over there to run that with him, and we did that for 5 years together. And then, do you remember the spotted owl incident where it shut down the woods in Oregon? And I mean, it really shut down. Our county went to 33% unemployment. And some man came in from Sacramento and wanted to buy half the town and wanted to buy our store, and we said sold. I mean, yes, sir. Yeah. And then I knew of an opportunity of a job in Northeast Georgia with a friend, so we moved out. Suzette came out, and I came out here in April of 1991, and flew out here, landed in Atlanta, and got off the plane and said, "Oh, this is what humidity feels like." It's not that way on the West Coast. Anyway, we went up to Rabun County and spent a week, and it was interesting. It was the perfect timing. All the azaleas, rhododendrons, all the dogwoods, everything was in full bloom, and we just thought, wow, this is cool. And something else interesting happened that really caught our eye, and this was kind of a psychological thing. Oregon rains many, many more days, but it doesn't rain as much volume. Like we had just kind of a light drizzle last week that just went on for a couple days and might have only measured a ½ inch. Well, Oregon can do that for 2 weeks and only measure 3/4 of an inch. It's just wet and drizzly. And when we came to Rabun County, the very first thing we noticed was color. People were wearing colorful clothes. We saw reds and blues and greens and yellows. And in Oregon, everybody was like depressed with grays and blacks. I'm serious. It was really true. Something about that kind of drizzly, cloudy, endless weather, it changes the way you are. And Suzette loves the sunshine. I was okay with that kind of weather better than she was. When we came, it was just like, everybody's wearing color. I mean, it really stood out. It caught our attention. Everybody's got color on. And we just fell in love with Rabun County, and I took the job and almost immediately started building the bees back up again. And that was 1991 when we moved here, and got here broke. The store didn't work good. The guy went bankrupt and never paid us the money he was supposed to. And when I went into the bee business in Georgia, I was worse than broke. I can even remember the number. We were $17,000 in debt. And I decided this is exactly what you don't want to do, but I did it and it worked. So I have to say, like, folks, don't do this at home kind of disclaimer here. I maxed out every credit card we had. I went down to the bank and took a personal. I did everything I could to get hands on any kind of cash. Because of my woodworking experience, I got a couple saws and just started making equipment. I'd go to construction sites. If it would make any part of a bee box, I picked it up. I mean, plywood, 2x4s, you name it. And that's how I built my outfit in the beginning. When we got back up to 500 colonies, and always stayed right there in Lakemont. We love it there. And then 5 years ago, we got that building that you saw. Kind of a story there. I mean, you want another story? I knew I wanted to get out of our basement. We had a big basement, 3,000 square feet, and that's where we were processing honey. And I was watching for property, even though I had no money to buy it. I'm going to get metaphysical on you here. I'm a firm believer in if you can put enough information in your creative imagination and stick with it, that life will make it happen. I really believe that. I proved it to myself dozens of times where we've just gone for broke and somehow the universe provided what we want because I knew what I wanted, I imagined what I wanted, and I was convinced I would get it. and we got it. Life works that way. Anyway, I was literally talking to real estate people. I was doing everything I could to look into property, even though I had no money to buy any. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? And I knew about this property here, and I asked the guy about it 4 or 5 times, and he always said, no, it's not for sale. He was partners with a doctor. They'd invested in it. And one day he flagged me down on, there's a road behind the building, that's Old 441 behind the building, and he flagged me down in the middle of the street and said, are you still interested in this property? And I said, well, yeah, but I don't have any money right now. And he said, the doc that owned half the, this was November 17th, I can actually remember the date. And he said, the doc needs $65,000 by January 1st, and if you can do that, we'll make the rest happen. So once again, I maxed out every... I went to the bank. The president of Rabun County Bank is a good friend of ours. His children are the same age as ours, and went to school together. And he trusted me. He knew me, and he says, "Okay, we'll help you make this happen." And it happened. And we got the lot, and we graded it off, and built the building. And it's for me, it's been like biting off more than you can chew, and then figuring out how to chew it. But we were always able to do that. And Suzette says, when are we going to stop spending money? And I said, when we're done. When we're done. We ain't done yet. Although I'm getting closer to 70 now, might not have all that many years left in me, we'll see. But it really has been an adventure. The bees have taken me places I never would have dreamed of. I've been in situations that were the blackest of holes and the brightest of lights. And looking back, I swear I wouldn't do anything different. It changed me. It built my character, whatever my character is. It had a big part in that. And I think we're done. I think I'm getting the hook. Thank you, Linda. I really appreciate you for asking me to do this. I really do. Yeah. Okay, thank you.